For several years, the Shugla kolkhoz was having cattle death and critically low crop yields because the kolkhoz head became a bit conceited and stopped listening to fellow villagers' advice. Young specialists, an agronomist Bakhidjan, a veterinary felcher Ksyusha, and a farmer Janas, took up the task of changing the situation. It was only half a century later that Mazhit Begalin's movie, It Was in Shugla, was screened in Kazakhstan. The movie was made in 1955, but in Soviet times it had a limited theatrical release. Its only copy is stored in the Russian Gosfilmofond. In 2018, the film was returned to Kazakhstan thanks to the Return of the Film to the Homeland campaign organized by Evgeny Lupov. The documentary director digitized the picture and made DVD copies, which allowed many viewers to enjoy the performance of such celebrities as Sabira Maikanova, Idris Nogaybayev, Kenyanbay Kozhabekov, and Bibigul Tuligenova. The movie production team also consisted of extremely talented people: script writer Abdilda Tajibayev, cameraman Alexander Yarolov, art director Kulahmet Khodjikov, and composer Evgeny Brusilovsky. Evgeny Lupov began to show interest in Mazhit Begalin's work early on in the university. He saw the movie Footprints Go Beyond the Horizon and caught a glimpse of Japanese minimalism with extensive use of visual means. From that moment on, his primary focus was on Kazakh cinematography. I think what I feel towards Mazhit Begalin can be called spiritual connection. It might sound a bit presumptuous of me since we are on completely different levels. But when I watched his work as a student, I discovered such level of poetics which I had yet to grow up to. But poetry and literature are what led me to cinematography, and this endeavor was very close to me. So when I saw it, even though it was a motion picture, I thought that something similar could be done in a documentary. And I was simply fascinated by the way this man did profound things, managed to incorporate very natural things into the universal, using the simplest tools, which perhaps are invisible to the viewer at the first glance. And he did it without pretentiousness or any unnecessary didactism, without any air of art house pomposity. But I was deeply affected by this movie and couldn't resist the urge to analyze it, break down the details to understand how he created it. How did he reshape my mindset and steer it in a completely different direction? How did he suddenly transport me from a small village far away in the mountains into the vast world of culture where I had to navigate and somehow find my way back? He perfectly laid out the clues. I was so immersed that for a while I forgot that I was a student who had to shoot documentaries. They say old love doesn't rust. After so many years, I continue this work, and I hope to write a book someday and even to make a movie to share my discoveries. I want to show that it's possible to make very simple, yet deep, very poetical and national, very subtle and yet piercing movies.
Очень национально, очень тонко и очень пронзительно делать кино.
Evgeny Lupov's research dedicated to the work of the outstanding Kazakh cinema maestro Mazhit Begalin is not finished yet, but it gradually revealed some new layers of the Kazakh cinema history. To be more precise, it pointed out some blank spaces in the case of rare materials preservation. So it was only natural that Evgeny and his team of like-minded people came up with the idea of creating the first and only online portal about Kazakh cinema history. Biographies, filmographies, rare photo, video and audio materials will be placed here in a digitized form.
Эти архивы из семейных таких карманов, да.
These archives from old family history boxes can shed some light on the past and give us an idea of how things were before. It's very important to understand where we're heading, because the history of cinema, like history in general, is cyclical on one hand, and on the other, new wave of Kazakh cinematography did not just appear out of thin air. It's based on what came before.
С другой стороны, понимаете, казахская новая волна не возникла из ничего.
Хочется большего, к полумерам не привыкших.
I want more. I want to dig deep and find the missing part of the history. I've studied the 60s, 80s, and 90s. I've analyzed the new wave and post-new wave cinema. I understand where everything is heading and where modern directors come from. But how can I just ignore the fact that there's almost a decade-long gap? It's confusing and impossible to let it go. It's like a missing puzzle piece.
Как это? Ну, это как пазл, которого не хватает.
Где-то с середины 70-х до середины 80-х.
The period from the mid-70s to the mid-80s in Kazakh cinematography is studied very poorly. Films were actively made, but we are familiar with only some vivid examples of children's movies, such as The Secret of the Singing Island, My House on the Green Hills. These were films that were aired on television and shown in cinemas. If you think about it, a certain number of Kazakh filmmakers graduated from the Russian State University of Cinematography in Moscow every year. One way or another, most of them ended up working at Kazakh Film Studio on documentary and motion picture films. And we still cannot find these movies and determine the names of these filmmakers. So it's both research and an investigation, which is very interesting for us.
Исследование и расследование. А что же было тогда?
Золотой век, там мы все про них знаем.
We know all about the golden age. All we must do is just find them. There's no big mystery behind this. But during the period of the 70s and beginning of the 80s, very few films were made and released. At that time, the country was about to undergo some political changes. Perestroika was just around the corner.
Определенные трансформации в самом языке, потому что там как бы оттепель прошла, где-то там вдалеке маячила перестройка, что-то в воздухе витало.
There was something different in the air, and not everybody could quite catch it. It was already reflected on the screen, though the number of directors in movies was small, still there were some. The problem is that National Film Studies skip from the 60s straight to the 80s and 90s, as if this period didn't exist.
Чтобы вот этого периода не было.
During that period, different kinds of films were made, but in small numbers, neither broadcasted nor released, they simply remained in the background. A gifted director and artist, Serik Raybaev, is a vivid example of that. No information about him has been known until today.
А всего-то и надо было позвонить сыну, позвонить его жене.
All we had to do was to call his family and offer them to share a story about their beloved father. Just a little push and people can pull out their dusty family's archives and voila, we have a true interesting story. After finding this information, you wonder how you could have ever overlooked it. But there's a lot to uncover from the 70s, 80s, early 90s.
Ник — это вот настоящий айсберг. Но их очень много. 70-х, 80-х.
Let's take Max Smagulov, for example. Everybody knows he was an important figure who owned a great studio, Catharsis, but when you type his name into Google search, there's nothing there. Nothing about this huge genius. I cannot comprehend how that could happen. This made me realize that the Kazakh new wave did not appear out of thin air. The cinema world had already been a place of experimentation when Rashid Nugmanov and his famous movie The Needle took the stage.
где уже было поле экспериментов.
Everything has a beginning, says Evgeny. Evolution is a gradual step-by-step process, not a sudden leap. The same concept applies to Kazakh cinematography, which Evgeny divides into specific time periods and the images and actions, characteristics of them.
Если мы говорим о 60-х, о наших мэтрах,
If we're talking about the 60s, about our great masters, we can call them pioneers.
Что с тобой, дорогой?
Устал. Зима была тяжелая. Когда весна подошла, так меня всего разломало. Трещат старые кости.
They were the very people who created movies such as Amangelde, which were patriotic, inspiring and elevating the spirit. Then during the 70s, new people come, and it is not clear what happens in the industry. They were romantics who had the will and skills to succeed, but failed. And that's why many of them quit quietly, leaving behind piles of masterpieces hidden under the bed.
себя под кроватью, стопки шедевров. А дальше 80-е приходят и вроде бы как...
In the 80s, it started to smell like freedom, and it seemed as if a powerful force was about to disrupt the cinema world. This was the time of brave, audacious people and bold breakthroughs. The ones who were ready to ride the postmodern wave and travel to new places. And Rashid Nugmanov, with his movie The Needle, was a great example. In the 90s, it was a different country, a different world altogether. Nothing was built yet, and it was unclear which path this young country would take. The most vivid example might be depicted in such works as Kairat, Cardiogram, and Killer, directed by Darijan Omirbaev. They gave this subtle feeling that there is an enormous world and a tiny hero who has no idea what to do with this world. Moving on to the 2000s, they were not similar to what we have today. The industry had to be developed based on market relations and considering capitalism.
Зритель может ходить на свое кино.
Evgeny's team is collecting information about this period piece by piece and organizing it in a way that would be easy to understand. The portal has a very convenient interface and navigation. Everything is systematized. Unique shots and moments from the production, exclusive copies of movie photos and posters, thematic books and magazines, stories of people involved in the creation of Kazakh cinema. Many materials were collected and digitized and cannot be encountered anywhere else.
Сейчас над проектом трудятся очень влюбленные в кино.
The specialists who are working on the project are in love with cinema. We plan to gradually add information on each filmmaker and update the material which already exists on the website.
Планомерный процесс, в который будут активны.
It is a long, systematic process which will actively involve film historians and competent specialists who are already familiar with archive work. Gradually, we will update and enrich this wonderful world of Kazakh cinema history with new names and new data.
Казахского кино, истории казахского кино новыми именами и новыми данными.
The creators of this unique portal have to search for some materials abroad and work with film studios in the former Soviet countries. Volunteers help them in the different regions. The team claims that all the archive materials they have collected are national treasures. This is not a commercial project. It will be available to everyone who is interested in Kazakh cinema art.
Не может фотография.
The same photo in a small format surely exists in a large one somewhere out there, just as a person who has been creating movies for 20 years cannot disappear without a trace. You're just not looking for them, but we are.
Просто не ищите. А вот мы ищем.